The relentless clatter of the train wheels had been a discordant symphony for days, each turn bringing Ilara farther from all she had known and closer to a future stitched together with the fragile threads of a stranger's promise. Her gloved hands, clasped tightly in her lap, concealed the tremor that had taken root deep within her. Outside the grimy window, the landscape had bled from tired greens to parched browns, a canvas of desolation that mirrored the growing emptiness in her heart. Redemption. The name of the town, printed starkly on her ticket, had once sounded like a benediction. Now, it felt like a judgment waiting to be passed. She carried with her a small, scuffed valise containing all her worldly possessions and a letter, its creases softened with anxious rereading, from Mr. Alistair Beaumont. He had written of a prosperous mercantile, a comfortable home, and the need for a companion, a wife. For Ilara, widowed, too young, and carrying a secret that was both a tender bud of hope and a source of profound shame in the eyes of her former world, his proposal had seemed a lifeline thrown into a turbulent sea. Apprehension was a cold knot in her stomach, yet a tiny, stubborn flame of hope still flickered. Perhaps here, so far from the judging eyes and whispered condemnations, she could build anew. The train shuddered to a halt, a final weary exhalation of steam hissing into the dry air. Ilara gathered her shawl more closely, a meager shield against the stares she anticipated, and stepped down onto the splintered platform. The sun, a brazen eye in the vast, pale sky, beat down with an unforgiving intensity. Redemption was little more than a single dusty street, flanked by raw timber buildings that seemed to crouch beneath the immense sky, their facades weathered and grim. A stout man, his waistcoat strained across a prosperous belly, consulted a pocket watch, his expression impatient. Mr. Alistair Beaumont. He matched the vague description in his letters. Ilara approached him, her heart a trapped bird against her ribs. "Mr. Beaumont," she ventured, her voice thinner than she intended. He turned, his gaze sweeping over her, sharp and assessing, lingering for a moment too long on the gentle swell beneath her traveling dress, a curve she had tried so desperately to conceal. His lips, full and ruddy, thinned into a line of profound displeasure. "You are not what was described," he stated, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden hush of the platform. There was no greeting, no kindness. A cold dread seeped into Ilara's bones. I am Ilara Vance," she managed, clutching her valise, "as per our correspondence." Correspondence that failed to mention certain encumbrances. Beaumont sneered, his eyes flicking pointedly to her abdomen again. He took a step back, as if from something contagious. "I sent for a wife, madam, not a ready-made family under dubious circumstances. I'll not take damaged goods, nor another man's leavings." The words, brutal and public, struck Ilara with the force of a physical blow. The station master, a gaunt man with sympathetic eyes, looked away. A woman, her face framed by a severe bonnet, tutted audibly. The fragile hope Ilara had nurtured crumbled into dust, leaving only raw, searing humiliation. She saw the sideways glances, the smirks, the cold judgment. The train, her last link to any semblance of a plan, let out a mournful whistle and began to chug slowly away, leaving her utterly alone on the platform, her small trunk a forlorn monument to her shattered expectations. Shock held her rigid for a moment, then a wave of despair so profound it threatened to buckle her knees washed over her. "Mr. Beaumont, please," she whispered, the plea dying on her lips as he turned his back with a dismissive wave and strode towards the main street, his indignation a palpable force. She was stranded, adrift in a sea of hostile faces, the very name of the town, a cruel mockery of her plight. The afternoon wore on, each tick of an unseen clock amplifying Ilara's desolation. The few coins in her reticule would not last long. She had inquired at the town's only boarding house, a grim-faced establishment run by a woman whose piety was as starched as her apron. Upon learning of Mr. Beaumont's public rejection, and with a swift, condemning glance at Ilara's form, the woman had declared there were no rooms available for her sort. The door had closed with a finality that echoed the slamming of a prison gate. The town itself felt like a fortress, its wooden walls unyielding, its windows like vacant eyes. There was no solace to be found in its dusty streets, only the averted gazes of its inhabitants and the whispers that seemed to follow her like persistent shadows. Defeated, she had wandered to the edge of the settlement, where the raw, unforgiving land began its relentless march towards the horizon. She found a measure of privacy beneath the sparse shade of a cottonwood clinging precariously to the bank of a dried-up creek bed, its leaves whispering dryly in the hot breeze. There, hidden from view, Ilara finally allowed the tears to come, hot and bitter, a torrent of grief for her lost husband, for her unborn child's uncertain future, for the dream of a new life that had been so cruelly extinguished. From the shadowed doorway of the town's farrier, Silas had witnessed the ugly spectacle at the station. He had seen Beaumont's pompous strut, the woman's fragile hope, and the swift, brutal dismissal. He knew Beaumont for what he was, a man whose wealth was outstripped only by his arrogance and cruelty. Silas was no stranger to the town's judgment. His own past, a tapestry woven with regret and violence, kept him on its periphery, a silent observer more often than a participant. He had seen Ilara later, a solitary, drifting figure, her shoulders slumped in a way that spoke of utter desolation. He recognized the look of a hunted thing, cornered and afraid. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the vast sky, casting long, mournful shadows, Silas made his way towards the creek bed. He moved with a quiet economy of motion, his worn boots making little sound on the hard-packed earth. Ilara started, her tear-stained face lifting in alarm as his tall, lean figure emerged from the gloom. He was a stark silhouette against the fading light, his features harsh, his eyes shadowed by the brim of his hat. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her despair. "You can't stay here," he said, his voice a low rumble, devoid of inflection, but not, she thought, unkind. It was a statement of fact, not a threat. He gestured vaguely towards the darkening plains. "Coyotes. Worse, maybe." Ilara scrambled to her feet, clutching her shawl. I have nowhere else," she stammered, her voice hoarse from weeping. Every instinct screamed at her to flee from this stranger, yet where could she run? Silas regarded her for a long moment, his gaze unreadable. He was a man carved from the harsh landscape itself, weathered and unyielding. Then he spoke again, the words reluctant, as if pulled from a deep well. "My place ain't much, but it's shelter, for the night at least." She stared at him, torn between a primal fear of the unknown and the stark reality of her situation. Another night alone in this wilderness, with her precious burden, was unthinkable. His eyes, when she dared to meet them, were surprisingly steady. They held no malice, none of the leering curiosity or cold judgment she had encountered in town. There was a weariness there, perhaps, a shared understanding of what it meant to be an outcast. Desperation, finally, tipped the scales. With a barely audible, "Thank you," she accepted. Silas's cabin stood a good distance from Redemption, nestled in a shallow dip of land, almost invisible until one was nearly upon it. It was small, constructed of rough-hewn logs, with a stone chimney at one end, from which a thin tendril of smoke curled into the twilight air. Inside, it was Spartan, but surprisingly clean. A single room served as kitchen, living space, and bedroom. A narrow cot stood against one wall, a rough blanket folded neatly upon it. A stone hearth, a simple table, and 2 chairs completed the furnishings. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and something else, something wild and earthy. The atmosphere between them was thick with unspoken questions and a palpable caution. Silas gestured towards the cot. "You take the bed," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He himself unrolled a bedroll near the hearth, an unspoken boundary established. Ilara, exhausted beyond words, could only nod her gratitude. Sleep, when it finally came, was a fitful, shallow thing, haunted by the day's cruelties. Days bled into a week, then two. A fragile, unspoken truce settled between them. Ilara, determined not to be a burden, rose early. She swept the packed earth floor, tended the small fire, and attempted to create meals from the sparse provisions Silas brought back from his hunting or his infrequent trips to town for supplies he couldn't procure himself. He was a man of few words, his presence a quiet, watchful constant. He chopped wood with a steady, rhythmic cadence, his movements economical and powerful. He would leave for hours, sometimes returning with a rabbit or a brace of quail, other times with nothing but the dust of the plains on his clothes. He never questioned her, never pressed for details of her past or her predicament. His silence, initially unnerving, became a strange sort of comfort. It was a silence that did not judge, that simply allowed her to be. Small, almost imperceptible gestures began to bridge the chasm of their unfamiliarity. One morning she found a single vibrant desert marigold in a tin cup on the table, its cheerful yellow, a stark contrast to the cabin's somber hues. Another day she mended a tear in his rough-spun shirt, her stitches neat and even, a skill learned in a gentler life. He had merely grunted an acknowledgement, but she saw the flicker of surprise, perhaps even appreciation, in his eyes. They learned each other's rhythms, the subtle shifts in mood, the unspoken needs. He noticed the way she cradled her belly when she thought he wasn't looking, the shadows of worry that often clouded her eyes. She, in turn, saw the deep lines etched around his mouth and eyes, testament to a life lived hard, the way his gaze would sometimes drift to the distant horizon, lost in thoughts he never shared. One evening, a chill wind howled outside, rattling the cabin's single window. Ilara sat by the fire, her fingers tracing the outline of a small, tarnished silver locket she wore around her neck. It contained a miniature portrait of her late husband, his smile gentle, his eyes kind. Silas sat across from her, sharpening a knife with slow, deliberate strokes, the rasp of stone on steel, a rhythmic counterpoint to the wind's mournful song. "He was a good man?" Silas asked, his voice unexpectedly soft, his gaze on the locket. Startled, Ilara looked up. It was the first personal question he had ever asked. She nodded, a lump forming in her throat. "The best," she whispered. And then the words began to flow, hesitant at first, then gaining strength, as if a dam had broken. She told him of Thomas, the young schoolteacher with a passion for poetry and a quiet strength. She spoke of their brief, happy marriage, cut short by a sudden fever that had swept through their village. She confessed her fear, her loneliness, and the desperation that had led her to answer Alistair Beaumont's advertisement, a last, desperate gamble for her and her unborn child. Silas listened without interruption, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. When she finally fell silent, her story told, he merely nodded. After a long pause, he said, his voice low, "Loss changes a man, or a woman." He didn't offer platitudes, just a simple acknowledgement of a shared human experience. He then spoke, briefly, elliptically, of a younger brother lost too soon, of mistakes made, and of a path he was still trying to walk away from. "Townfolk," he murmured, his gaze distant. "They got long memories for some things, and short ones for others." A fragile thread of mutual empathy, spun from shared sorrow and unspoken understanding, began to weave itself between them. A semblance of routine, fragile yet comforting, settled over their lives in the small cabin. Ilara found a patch of workable soil near the door, and using a sharpened piece of wood Silas had fashioned for her, began to coax a few hardy vegetable seeds, procured by Silas on a rare trip into Redemption's general store, into life. The shared meals, though simple, became less strained. An unspoken companionship, a quiet reliance developed, The constant, gnawing fear that had been Ilara's companion for so long began to recede, replaced by a tentative sense of safety. The baby within her grew, a steady, reassuring presence. But the outside world, with its harsh judgments and unyielding codes, could not be kept at bay forever. Whispers, like tumbleweeds, drifted from redemption to the isolated cabin. Alistair Beaumont, his pride wounded and his self-importance pricked by Ilara's continued existence in the vicinity, even if not under his roof, began to sow seeds of malice. He painted Ilara as a woman of loose morals, insinuating that Silas, a man with a shadowed past, had perhaps not rescued her, but rather taken advantage of her vulnerability. One blustery afternoon, their fragile peace was shattered by the arrival of two men from town. One was Deacon Miller, a man whose piety was as rigid as his spine, his face a mask of stern disapproval. The other was a burly, taciturn man, Ilara, vaguely recognized as a crony of Beaumont's. They had come, Deacon Miller announced, on a matter of public decency and concern. "Mr. Kane," the deacon addressed Silas, his voice sharp with accusation, "it has come to the town council's attention that you are harboring this woman." He gestured towards Ilara with a dismissive flick of his wrist, as if she were a stray animal. "Her circumstances are irregular, and your living arrangement is a scandal to the good people of Redemption." Silas, who had been splitting wood, straightened slowly, the axe still in his hand, his eyes, cold as winter frost, fixed on the deacon. Ilara felt a tremor of fear, not for herself, but for him. She saw the coiled tension in his shoulders, the dangerous stillness that settled over him. "She needed shelter," Silas stated, his voice flat. "I provided it." "Shelter?" Deacon Miller scoffed. "Or something more illicit? The town whispers, Mr. Kane. They speak of impropriety. This woman was rejected by a respectable citizen for good reason. Her presence here, with you, a man of questionable reputation, taints us all." Ilara stepped forward, her hands clenched. "I have done nothing wrong," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "Mr. Beaumont is a cruel, heartless man, and Mr. Kane has shown me nothing but kindness." The deacon ignored her, his gaze fixed on Silas. "The council demands that this arrangement cease. The woman must be sent away, or you, Kane, will face consequences." Silas took a step forward, the movement deceptively casual, yet it made both men flinch. He planted the axe head firmly in the chopping block. "She stays," he said, his voice a low growl. He looked directly at the deacon, then at his companion. "She's under my protection." Then, after a beat of charged silence, he added, his words clear and deliberate, resonating in the sudden stillness, "She's my wife." Ilara gasped, her eyes flying to his. His face was impassive, but she saw the flicker in his eyes, a challenge, a declaration. It was a lie, a shield thrown up against the world's censure, but in that moment it felt more real, more binding than any vow spoken in a church. Deacon Miller sputtered, taken aback by Silas's bald assertion, but the certainty in Silas's voice and the dangerous glint in his eyes gave him pause. After a few more blustered threats and warnings about the sanctity of marriage, which Silas met with stony silence, the two men retreated, their mission clearly unaccomplished, but the threat lingered in the air like a foul odor. Beaumont, far from being deterred by Silas's claim, was incensed. His ego, already bruised, now felt thoroughly trampled. That a woman he had cast off should find refuge, let alone a supposed husband, in a man like Silas Kane, a former outlaw he considered beneath contempt, was an intolerable insult. His whispers turned into louder accusations. He began to paint Silas not just as a man of questionable reputation, but as a dangerous criminal, a wolf in sheep's clothing, and Ilara as his willing accomplice, or perhaps his prisoner. He found a ready ally in the town's sheriff, a man named Grice, whose loyalty was easily bought and whose sense of justice was as flexible as Beaumont's purse strings. The escalating crisis materialized one moonless night. Ilara had been restless, the baby active within her, A sudden, acrid smell of smoke jolted her fully awake. Silas was already on his feet, moving towards the door, a grin set to his jaw. Outside, flames licked at the small, lean-to shed where they stored firewood, and Silas kept his few tools. It wasn't a large fire, not yet, but it was deliberately set, a clear message of intimidation. Together, they fought the blaze, Silas with a grim determination, Ilara, despite her cumbersome pregnancy, fetching water from the barrel with a desperate energy she hadn't known she possessed. They managed to extinguish it before it could spread to the cabin, but the shed was a blackened ruin, their meager wood supply gone. As the last embers died, leaving them smoke-stained and exhausted in the cold pre-dawn air, Ilara knew this was more than just random malice. This was a targeted attack, a promise of worse to come. "He won't stop," she whispered, her voice raw from smoke and fear, looking at Silas. His face, illuminated by the first pale streaks of dawn, was hard, his eyes like chips of flint. "No," Silas agreed, his voice tight. "He won't." He looked at the ruined shed, then back at the cabin, at Ilara. A muscle twitched in his jaw. She saw in his eyes a resurgence of the old hardness, the shadow of the outlaw he once was, but now it was tempered by something new, a fierce protectiveness that encompassed her and the small, vulnerable life she carried. The next day, Sheriff Grice arrived, not to investigate the arson, but to deliver a summons. Beaumont had lodged a formal complaint, accusing Silas of threatening behavior and Ilara of being a vagrant of ill repute, whose presence was a danger to the community. The summons demanded their appearance before a hastily convened town council meeting, a meeting Ilara knew would be little more than a kangaroo court orchestrated by Beaumont. "We can't just let them do this," Ilara said, her initial fear giving way to a surge of defiant anger. She was no longer the timid, broken woman who had arrived at the station. The quiet strength she had found in Silas's sanctuary, the burgeoning life within her, had kindled a resilience she hadn't known she possessed. "Your claim that I am your wife. Perhaps it is time to make that true, if only in their eyes." It was a desperate gambit, a shield against their accusations. Silas looked at her, a long, searching gaze. The thought had crossed his mind too, a pragmatic solution to a dangerous problem, but her voicing it, her willingness to tie herself to him, even in pretense, stirred something deeper. "It's a heavy chain to offer, Ilara," he said quietly. "Some chains offer protection, Silas," she replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "And some choices are made for us by circumstance. This, perhaps, is one we make together." Their unspoken commitment, forged in shared hardship and mutual respect, deepened in the face of this new threat. They faced the crisis together, their bond solidified by the shared danger. Silas, though reluctant to dredge up old skills, began to subtly fortify the cabin, his movements betraying a practiced vigilance. Ilara, using the education that had once seemed so useless in this harsh land, began to think of how she might articulate their defense, how she might turn Beaumont's own hypocrisy against him. The pretense of wife had become a silent vow of solidarity, a shared armor against the coming storm. He had taken a risk in claiming her. Now she would stand by him, whatever the cost. The town hall, a drafty, barn-like structure, was crowded. Curiosity, malice, and a reluctant sympathy warred on the faces of the assembled townsfolk. Alistair Beaumont sat at the front, beside Sheriff Grice and Deacon Miller, his expression a smug mask of righteous indignation. Ilara felt a tremor of her old fear, but Silas's hand, resting lightly on the small of her back as they entered, was a steadying presence. Beaumont launched into his tirade, painting Silas as a menace and Ilara as a designing woman, a blight on redemption's moral fabric. He spoke of Silas's outlaw past, conveniently omitting his own cruel rejection that had left Ilara destitute. Sheriff Grice nodded along, his face impassive but his bias clear. Deacon Miller added pronouncements on sin and societal decay. When Beaumont finally paused for breath, a hush fell over the room. All eyes turned to Silas and Ilara. Silas stood, tall and unbowed, his silence more powerful than Beaumont's bluster. He simply said, "This woman is my wife. She is under my protection. We have harmed no one. We wish only to be left in peace." Then, before anyone could interrupt, Ilara stepped forward. Her voice, though not loud, carried a surprising clarity and strength, honed by months of quiet resolve. "Mr. Beaumont speaks of morality," she began, her gaze sweeping over the council, then settling on Beaumont himself. "But where was his morality when he summoned me across a continent with promises of a home, only to cast me aside, pregnant and alone, because I did not meet his exacting and shallow criteria? He calls me a vagrant, yet it was his actions that made me so." She spoke of her late husband, a good and honorable man. She spoke of her desperation and of the advertisement that had seemed a providential escape. "He speaks of my ill repute," she continued, her voice gaining passion. "Yet who here displayed greater dishonor, the man who callously abandoned a vulnerable woman or the man who offered her shelter when no one else would?" She looked directly at Beaumont. "You, sir, are a hypocrite. You speak of community standards, yet you violate the most basic tenets of human decency." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some faces, previously hostile or indifferent, now showed flickerings of doubt, even sympathy. The station master, emboldened, stood up. "She speaks true. I saw it." Beaumont turned her away, cruel, like, right there on the platform, with her not knowing a soul. An older woman, Martha Henderson, a respected widow known for her sharp tongue and fair mind, rose. "Deacon Miller, Sheriff Grice," she said, her voice firm, "this ain't justice. This is a vendetta. This woman and Silas Kane have bothered no one out on their little patch. Beaumont's pride is what's on trial here, not their character." The tide was turning. Beaumont's face purpled with rage, but his bluster seemed to deflate under the weight of Ilara's dignified condemnation and the unexpected support from corners of the community. Sheriff Grice, ever attuned to the shifting winds of public opinion, began to look uneasy. Deacon Miller cleared his throat, suddenly less sure of his righteous pronouncements. Silas stood beside Ilara, a silent, unwavering pillar of support, his presence a testament to their united front. He didn't need to resort to the violence of his past. Her courage, her words, were their strongest defense. Beaumont, sputtering and discredited, found his support evaporating. The hastily convened council, sensing the shift in the room, mumbled about needing to reconsider the evidence. Sheriff Grice, eager to distance himself from a losing cause, declared the matter would require further investigation, a clear signal that no immediate action would be taken against Silas and Ilara. Beaumont, his face a mask of fury and humiliation, stormed out of the hall. His power in redemption significantly diminished, his hypocrisy laid bare for all to see. In the immediate aftermath, a profound sense of relief, mingled with exhaustion, settled over Ilara and Silas. The threat had not vanished entirely, but its teeth had been drawn. They returned to their cabin, the path ahead uncertain, but no longer overshadowed by imminent peril. The confrontation had changed something not only in the town's perception of them, but also within their small, unconventional household. The word wife, spoken first as a shield, then as a declaration of solidarity, now hung in the air between them, imbued with a new, unspoken meaning. With the shadow of Beaumont's malice largely lifted, a fragile peace settled upon them. The townsfolk, many of whom had been swayed by Ilara's courage and Martha Henderson's endorsement, began to regard them with a grudging respect, or at least a cautious neutrality. Silas, with Ilara's help, rebuilt the burned shed, stronger this time. The small garden Ilara had tended so diligently began to yield its bounty, a tangible symbol of their perseverance. They still lived on the periphery, but the isolation felt less like exile and more like chosen sanctuary. A few weeks later, as the first chill of autumn nipped the air, Ilara's time came. It was Silas who acted as midwife, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle, his quiet presence a rock in the storm of her labor. When her son was born, a healthy, lusty infant with a thatch of dark hair, it was into Silas's hands that he first emerged. Ilara, watching Silas hold the tiny, squirming bundle, his weathered face softened by an emotion she couldn't quite name, felt a profound sense of completion, of a circle closed. This was her family, forged not by blood or societal convention, but by shared hardship, mutual respect, and a love that had grown quietly, unexpectedly, in the harsh soil of the frontier. They named him Thomas, after Ilara's first love, a tribute to the past that had brought her to this improbable present. Silas, who had never expected to hold a child of his own, found a new purpose in the small life that now depended on them. He carved a cradle from smooth pine, his knife-work intricate and loving. Ilara, her heart overflowing, watched him and knew she had found more than just shelter. She had found a home, a partner, a future she had never dared to dream of. The town of Redemption, initially a place of cruel rejection, had, through a winding and arduous path, lived up to its name, offering not forgiveness for past sins, but the chance for a new beginning. Their cabin, once a mere refuge, transformed into a home. Laughter, a sound seldom heard before, now mingled with the baby's cries and coos. Ilara, using her education, began to teach a few of the more isolated homesteaders' children who had no access to a formal school, her small kitchen table becoming a makeshift classroom. Silas, his past as an outlaw fading into a distant memory, found his practical skills in demand, helping neighbors with repairs or difficult chores, his quiet competence earning him a new kind of respect. One crisp evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of fiery orange and soft lavender, Ilara stood on their small porch, Thomas cradled in her arms. Silas came to stand beside her, his arm resting gently around her shoulders. They watched the stars begin to prick the darkening canvas, a vast, silent testament to the enduring beauty of the world. The hardships they had faced were not forgotten, but they no longer defined them. Instead, they were the foundations upon which their new life, their found family, had been built. Here, on the edge of the wilderness, they had discovered that resilience could blossom in the most unforgiving landscapes, that kindness could be found in the most unexpected quarters, and that home was not a place, but a sanctuary built by love, courage, and the unwavering belief in a shared tomorrow.